There is an old Japanese folk tale, and it goes like this. Yuki was a small boy who lived with his family in the village. His late grandfather had taught Yuki much about raising rice crops, solving disputes, and about the ways of the world. He was the most respected man in their village. Now Yuki's family cultivated the enormous fields of rice that his grandfather had passed on to them. Yuki's village was nestled by the shore below a small mountain. One day, Yuki was playing on top of the small mountain, watching the preparations below for a festival that was going to take place that very night to celebrate a bumper rice crop. All of a sudden, Yuki felt an earthquake beneath his feet. The houses below, by the sea, rocked gently several times, then all became still again. Soon after, Yuki noticed something even more strange. The sea darkened all of a sudden, and it seemed to be rushing backward toward the horizon. The sea was actually running away from the shore very fast, leaving behind wide stretches of beach that had never been exposed before. With a gasp, Yuki suddenly remembered the words of his grandfather. His grandfather told him that just before a terrible tsunami, the sea suddenly and quickly rolls backward. Yuki, his breath heavy, ran down the mountainside to warn the people of the impending danger. Already many had run to the beach to witness the spectacular new stretch of ribbed sand. Get back, shouted the boy. There is terrible danger." "What are you talking about, Yuki?" laughed one person. "Look at all the great new shells on the beach." No, you don't understand," cried Yuki. "You must run away, up to the mountain, everybody." But no one would listen to him. They all laughed in his face and carried on romping in the newly exposed beach as Yuki watched the sea roll ever further back. Desperate, Yuki could only think of one thing to do. He lit a pine torch and hurried with it to the fields. There, hundreds of rice stacks stood golden and dried in the sun. He touched the torch to the edge of each one, hurrying from one to the other as quickly as his legs would carry him. The sun-dried stalks instantly caught fire. The strengthening sea breeze blew the blaze forward. Soon the stacks burst into flame. Yuki, terrified, ran after his friends and family, calling, "Fire! Fire! Everyone, run to the mountain, quick!" The people hurried from all over the beach. All the while, the sea was fleeing even more quickly toward the horizon. The whole village was moving up the mountain now. The growing multitude, still knowing nothing, looked horrified at the flaming fields and at the destruction of their homes and their livelihood. "Yuki is mad," cried one of the boys when they had all reached the top. "He set fire to the rice on purpose. I saw him do it." The villagers grew angry. "Yuki, is this true?" said Yuki's mother and father, frowning deeply. Yuki hung his head. Just then someone cried, "Look!" At the edge of the horizon, they saw a long, dim line, like the shadowing of a new island where no island had ever been. For that long, thin line of darkness was the returning sea, towering like a cliff and raging swiftly toward them. "A tsunami!" shrieked the people. Their shrieks were drowned out by a nameless shock, heavier than any thunder, as the colossal swell struck the shore with a weight that sent a shudder through the hills, with a burst of foam like a blaze of sheet lightning. For an instant nothing could be seen but a storm of spray rushing up the slope like a cloud, and the people scattered back in panic from the mere menace of it. When they looked again, they saw a white horror of sea roaring over the village and their burning homes. It drew back, tearing out the land as it went. Twice, 3 times, 5 times, the sea struck the land and ebbed. Then finally, the sea returned to its normal place and stayed there. On the mountain, for a long time, no word was spoken. All stared, stunned into silence at the sight of the desolation below, at the wreckage and debris that was scattered over what was left of their village. "I'm sorry I burned the field," said Yuki, his voice trembling. "Yuki," said his father softly, "you saved us all." And the villagers swept up Yuki and raised him into the air. "We were going to celebrate our rice harvest tonight," said one villager, "but now we'll celebrate that we're all still alive." And they cheered with relief and admiration at the brave Yuki, who that day had saved thousands of lives. But now it is time for a story that has no Yuki.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the podcast of Doom. the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. I'm your host, David Appleson. Today we will examine the earthquake and tsunami that devastated the coastal regions along the Indian Ocean on December 26, 2004, what is known throughout much of the world as Boxing Day. Early that morning, a giant continental plate abruptly slipped beneath another giant continental plate off the coast and miles beneath the ocean floor of northern Sumatra, one of the major islands in the archipelago that comprises the nation of Indonesia. That abrupt slip unleashed not only one of the largest earthquakes in the last 100 years, it displaced billions of gallons of water, triggering a tsunami, or ripple of the ocean waters, that spread out not just across the Indian Ocean, but all over the world. The word tsunami originates from the Japanese, who have a long history of tsunamis, with su meaning harbor, and nami meaning wave. The ripples moved at tremendous speeds, almost undetected by the ships above, until these ripples approached the coast where they slowed down and grew into enormous waves, some as high as 100 feet or 30 meters. Those waves hit a collection of communities, some residential and some based around tourism, catching many people there completely by surprise. The waves swept towns, structures, and people inland, crushing and drowning those who got caught up in the waves, in the rushing water and debris. The water would then retreat, reversing its course, sweeping out far away from the beaches, only to return again in a cyclical process. In the end, more than 230,000 people would die from the quake and tsunami across more than 24 countries. It was the worst natural disaster of the 21st century, and much of the death and destruction could have been prevented with a fairly inexpensive warning system. The Boxing Day earthquake of 2004 was the third largest earthquake of the last 100 years. It was a magnitude 9.1 or 9.0 earthquake, depending on which source you use. Either number still makes it the third largest and also roughly equal to the Tohoku, Japan earthquake and tsunami in March 2011. The only two earthquakes which were larger were the Good Friday earthquake in Prince William Sound, Alaska of 1964 at 9.2 and the monstrous Great Chilean earthquake of 1960 with an unbelievable magnitude of 9.5. Any earthquake at 9 or above will cause widespread catastrophic damage to nearby communities with guaranteed death and injuries to anyone living near the epicenter. Fortunately, in those two other cases, in Chile and Alaska, the earthquake struck in low population density areas, thus mitigating some of the human suffering. Both the Sumatran and Japanese earthquakes occurred near high population areas, causing massive injuries and deaths, numbering in the tens of thousands for Japan, and the hundreds of thousands for those living near the Indian Ocean. The worst earthquakes and tsunamis aren't measured by their magnitude, but by their proximity to large population centers and the preparedness of those localities for such disasters. In order to understand why earthquakes and tsunamis happen, we will need to briefly explore the theory of plate tectonics. The Earth is composed of several layers. The two outer layers are the lithosphere and the asthenosphere. They form the mantle. The lithosphere is cooler and more rigid, while the asthenosphere is hotter and flows more easily. The key principle of plate tectonics is that the lithosphere exists as separate and distinct tectonic plates, which ride on the fluid-like asthenosphere. The continental plates move because of the intense heat in the Earth's core that causes molten rock in the mantle layer to move. It moves in a pattern called a convection cell that forms when warm material rises, cools, and eventually sinks downward. As the cooled material sinks down, it is warmed and rises again. Although these plates are in motion, it is not the type of motion that humans would ordinarily perceive. A typical plate moves 10 to 40 millimeters per year, or about as fast as your fingernails grow. Over a period of millions of years, these distances can become quite vast. Tectonic lithosphere plates consist of a lithospheric mantle overlain by one or two types of crustal material, oceanic crust and continental crust. The average oceanic lithosphere is typically 100 kilometers or 62 miles thick. Because it is formed at mid-ocean, it forms ridges and spreads outward, and its thickness is therefore a function of its distance from the mid-ocean ridge where it was formed. There are 7 major plates around the globe, as well as a number of minor plates. As these plates grow and move, they bump into each other. When that happens, most often one plate will buckle and move beneath the other plate. Where these 2 plates meet is called a plate boundary, and where the one plate sinks beneath the other plate is called a subduction zone. It is in the area of these subduction zones, where the 2 plates are moving against each other, that earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes occur. The hypocenter, or subterranean origin of the Indonesian earthquake, was approximately 160 kilometers or 100 miles off the western coast of northern Sumatra, in the Indian Ocean just north of Simeulue Island, at a depth of 30 kilometers or 19 miles below mean sea level. The northern section of the Sunda megathrust, a fault line where the tectonic plates meet, ruptured over a length of 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles, triggering a massive earthquake. That earthquake was felt in Bangladesh, India, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, but because of its proximity, was most violently felt in Sumatra. Splay faults, or secondary pop-up faults, caused long, narrow parts of the seafloor to pop up in seconds. This quickly elevated the height and increased the speed of the waves, destroying the closest population center, the Indonesian town of Luhanga, which was completely obliterated except for the town mosque. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake was unusually large in geographical and geological extent. The fault surface slipped or ruptured about 15 meters or 50 feet along the subduction zone, where the Indian plate slides or subducts under the overriding Burma plate. This subduction zone is said to have stick-flip frictional properties. If you've ever used a rake to gather up leaves, you understand there is friction between the rake and the uneven ground, and energy is released when the rake slips over a rough piece of ground and the prongs of the rake quickly flick out. In this case, the edge of the Burma plate clung to and was pushed downward by the Indian plate, building up energy as the Indian plate continued its downward movement, until a slip occurred and vast amounts of energy were released when the Burma plate shot upwards. This slip did not happen instantaneously, but it took place in 2 phases over several minutes. Seismographic and acoustic data indicate that the first phase involved a rupture about 400 kilometers or 250 miles long and 100 kilometers or 60 miles wide, making it the largest rupture ever known to have been caused by an earthquake. The rupture proceeded at about 2.8 kilometers per second or 6,200 miles per hour, beginning off the coast of Aceh and proceeding northwesterly for about 100 seconds. After a pause of another 100 seconds, the rupture continued northwards towards the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. However, the northern rupture occurred more slowly than in the south, at about 2.1 kilometers per second or 4,700 miles per hour, continuing north for another 5 minutes to a plate boundary where the fault type changes. The abrupt rise in the seafloor displaced an estimated 30 cubic kilometers or hundreds of billions of gallons of water, triggering the devastating tsunami waves. The waves radiated outwards along the entire 1,600-kilometer length of the rupture and were detected as far away as Mexico, Chile, and the Arctic. The raising of the seafloor significantly reduced the capacity of the Indian Ocean, producing a permanent rise in the global sea level by an estimated 1/10 of 1 millimeter. It also caused the entire planet to vibrate. The Earth was momentarily knocked off its axis by 1 centimeter. The energy released across the surface of the planet was equivalent to 1,500 Hiroshima bombs, but less than history's biggest atomic bomb ever, the Soviet Tsar Bomba, which gives you an idea of just how powerful that bomb was. But most of the earthquake's power was actually underground, as it was centered several miles below the Earth's surface. The total energy of the quake above and below the surface was about equal to 550 million Hiroshima bombs, or enough energy to power the entire United States for 370 years. No wonder it knocked the Earth off its axis. It was the abrupt rise of the seafloor that resulted in the tsunami waves rippling across the ocean, radiating in a long line where the rupture had occurred and spreading outward. The ripples emanated out not in a perfect circle, but in what I would describe as more of a kidney bean pattern. In deep water, these waves are hardly noticeable, and even ships on the surface might not have noticed anything unusual as the waves passed by. Satellite imagery available after the event indicated only a 2-foot rise as the waves passed through the deep sea. But in those deep waters, the waves moved extremely fast, anywhere from 300 to 600 miles per hour or 500 to 1,000 kilometers per hour, meaning it did not take long for the waves to reach the nearest land. Once the waves reached the shallow waters near the coastlines, the waves slowed down considerably to about 6 miles per hour, but rising above the surface of the sea to enormous heights. Some of the tsunami waves that hit Sumatra were measured as high as 100 feet, or 30 meters. At 7:59 in the morning local time, the earthquake began off the northern coast of Sumatra in West Indonesia. Within 15 minutes, the quake was detected by seismograph equipment throughout the world. At the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii, a bulletin was issued announcing the earthquake. Initially, there was confusion about the size of the quake, with Hawaii reporting it at 8.1 and Indonesia reporting it at 6.6, much smaller. Every full point increase in magnitude represents a quake 30 times more powerful. Indonesia had no tsunami warning system in place at the time. The community most impacted by the earthquake was Banda Aceh in northern Sumatra. This city of 300,000 people felt the full brunt of the 9.1 quake, which shook intermittently for 10 minutes. Just a few seconds of shaking in an earthquake of that magnitude would be nightmarish. It's hard to imagine severe shaking that lasts as long as 10 minutes. Most of the buildings in the area that were 3 stories tall or higher suffered extensive damage, including those that were reinforced. The city was not prepared for a major disaster. The earthquake was so strong that it knocked people to the ground. One observer described a really loud noise, like an airplane. The shaking was so severe and lengthy that citizens described being unable to walk or even to squat. The only thing they could do was to lie down on the ground. When the shaking stopped, many citizens left their homes to survey the damage. Many others searched for family members. The next event was a recurring theme among every coastal community affected by the earthquake and tsunami. The waters began to recede. The waters withdrew in a rapid fashion, surprising many who were not familiar with the phenomenon. One eyewitness in Banda Aceh, Rizal Surapong, estimated the sea had withdrawn as much as 4 kilometers or about 2.5 miles. He could see fish flopping on the seabed. Fishing boats were also left stranded on coral reefs. Rizal then heard what sounded like an enormous explosion. He looked up to see a towering black wall of water on the horizon heading his way. He would survive, but not before getting pounded by the waves. According to a paper by UNESCO, if the wave is visible on the horizon, it may already be too close to escape by going inland or to high ground. The best course of action, then, may be to seek safety in a tall building, water tower, or tree. So don't wait for the big black wave. Run for high ground if you experience an earthquake at the coast. Other witnesses reported strange behavior in seabirds, who seemed to be frantically flying away from the ocean. The UNESCO paper goes on to say that because tsunamis are relatively rare or seldom hit the same area twice, many residents do not correlate a strong earthquake with a big tsunami. The paper states, "Repeatable history provides the earliest warning of future tsunamis. This warning system depends, however, on geological records that are easily destroyed and on human records that are easily lost or forgotten. Moreover, even a well-remembered past may span too little time to include a catastrophic tsunami, like the one in 2004 that takes many centuries to repeat. Over 100 tsunamis are known from the last 4 centuries of Indonesia's written history. On average, in the last decade and a half, a tsunami happens somewhere in the archipelago every other year. Yet the time between tsunamis at any one place commonly spans decades or even centuries. Such long times between successive tsunamis contributed to the recent tsunami losses in Aceh and southern Java. The tsunami struck the west and north coasts of northern Sumatra, particularly in Aceh province, 15 to 20 minutes after the shaking from the earthquake stopped. At Ulilu in Banda Aceh, a survivor described 3 waves, with the first wave rising only to the foundation of the buildings. This was followed by a large withdrawal of the sea before the second and third waves hit. The second was bigger than the first. A local resident living at Banda Aceh stated that the wave was higher than my house. Another resident living 2 kilometers from the coast, on the outskirts of the city, said the tsunami was like a wall, very black in color, and had a distinct sound, getting louder as it neared the coast. The maximum run-up height of the tsunami was measured at a hill between Luhunanga and Lupang on the west coast of the northern tip of Sumatra, near Banda Aceh, and reached more than 30 meters, or 100 feet. The tsunami waves that inundated Banda Aceh were a mixture of salt water, dirt, sewage, garbage, and debris. In some places, in 10 minutes, a 3-meter-high wall of water, mud, and debris swept almost 10 kilometers inland. Densely packed, inhabited waterfront areas were swept clean, leaving nothing but a few foundations among puddles and ponds. Many people died not from drowning, but because they were thrown against buildings or cut by swift-flowing pieces of tree, wood, or metal. It was like Armageddon, remembered Zulkarnain Buyong, a 30-year-old construction worker. We didn't know it was a wave. We thought it was some kind of rain-caused flood. Everything behind us was black, the sky, the water. Buyong ran. Little high ground exists in Banda Aceh, which is built along a palm-studded coastal plain, but Buyong managed to scramble up a bridge, clutching his wife and their 2-year-old daughter. They watched, horrified, as the strangely voracious water swallowed up relatives and neighbors. A brother and nephew disappeared as Buyong looked down helpless. I watched. I couldn't do anything, he recalled. The tsunami obliterated a swath of the city stretching 3 miles from the sea. It lifted 75-foot-long fishing boats and dumped them in the middle of the city, deposited hundreds of bodies in front of what had been brightly lit shops on Panglima Polim Street. Single-story wooden houses were dismantled as if they were made of sticks, and trees were pulled out like blades of grass. South along Sumatra's long Indian Ocean coastline, entire villages disappeared without a trace. In Banda Aceh, many were outside checking the damage from the earthquake. One resident said, "I heard the earthquake had destroyed the Pante shopping mall up the road, and I went to have a look. I was looking at the building, and I turned around to see the water coming into the city from 2 directions. The waves looked empty, but on top they were carrying everything from cars to the roofs of houses. I ran." The surges of water poured through the streets, carrying away much of what was in their path. Vehicles were picked up and carried along with timbers, pieces of concrete, and bodies. It was moving faster than anyone could run. A man who was at a market, a mile inland, said he jumped on his motorbike when he saw the wall of water coming. He joined panicked people in cars, other motorbikes, and on foot. Some were shouting out to God for forgiveness. He said he looked back once and saw the wave toss 2 fishing boats in the air. Another survivor said he huddled on the balcony of a friend's house and watched the water carry off people and cars. He made a rope from clothes and saris and managed to pull 10 people to safety. After the waves went as far inland as they could, the backwash began. It produced a loud sucking sound, and in many cases was more dangerous than the initial wave. One observer later said, "I will never forget the screaming of those being washed out to sea." Once inland, the tsunami waves crested at 4 to 39 meters, or 14 to 130 feet above ground level, depending on topography, and destroyed more than 250 coastal communities. Residential neighborhoods and fishing villages in coastal areas were entirely devastated, and houses were swept inland or out to sea. The traditional construction that had resisted shaking damage could not resist the tsunami forces, and most were obliterated. Several 1- and 2-story administrative buildings and machine shops were smashed by waves carrying large oil storage tanks. The low-lying topography of Banda Aceh and surrounding areas and the height of the water resulted in debris being swept in and out by the 3 successive destructive tsunami waves. This caused large, heavy projectiles such as cars, trucks, and fishing boats to be swept in and out, each time impacting previously undamaged facilities. Many small buildings were structurally damaged by tsunami waves carrying floating debris. A large number of fishing boats were docked at the coastal and river locations that traversed the city. Fishing boats were torn from their moorings and cast inland during the tsunami. One boat that was permanently docked on the 2nd story of a house helped save 52 people, who were able to climb through the roof hatch and take shelter there. Inside, they found a stranded security guard in the captain's quarters. Nazoruddin Musu, a then 32-year-old man from Banda Aceh, remembered what happened to him on that day. I was at a great fishing spot in Krueng Kut village when I felt the earthquake. I wasn't worried, but I thought I should check on my family. I arrived home about 15 minutes later, and my wife and son were fine, so I was thinking about driving around town to look at the damage from the earthquake. At that time, I never could have imagined the tsunami, but minutes later I saw the water coming toward us. It was washing up houses and gathering speed. I grabbed my son and my wife and we ran. There was a huge wall behind our house, and we only just managed to scale it in time. It was a life-or-death moment because the water was right behind us. We ran to a 2-story building, and the next moment I saw the first wave take hundreds of people. I ran down and picked up a small girl lying on the ground and took her up to the 2nd floor. Then the second wave hit. After the first wave, I could see the dead and injured, but the second wave was devastating. It just swept everything away. Nazaria, then 34, also from Banda Aceh, recalled her brush with death. My baby was 6 months old, and my first instinct was to grab him. I heard people screaming outside. The water was coming, and I saw many people running. Then I heard something smack against the house, and I knew I was not going to be safe on the 2nd floor. My husband and my other children were out, so I ran with my baby and my mother. The first wave hit us, but we managed to hold on to each other. I was so scared that I would lose them, so I held on as tight as I could. The water carried us to a police station near my house, and a policeman there pulled us out of the water. Then the second very strong wave came. We ran up to the 2nd floor, but the water was filling up the whole room. I thought we might get trapped and drown in there. But the policeman started bashing at the ceiling, and he made a hole so we could climb into the roof. It was an amazing moment. I was thanking God when the water started to go down. Fauzia, 34 years old at the time, was also separated from her spouse. I knew I had to escape, but my husband had taken the motorbike when he went shopping, and I was at home with our 5 children, she said. I had no idea what to do. I was just thinking that I had to get to the 2nd floor of a house nearby. What I remember was that the wave was really black. At first we weren't sure if it was oil or water. When it came up to us on the 2nd floor, it felt like Judgment Day. I thought my children and I were all going to die. Panicking, my son made a hole in the roof and climbed up. One by one, he pulled us up. I was amazed by him. After that, we realized a boat had landed on top of the house. From the roof, I could also see many people floating in the water. We climbed up into the boat, and then I started praying. I was worried about my parents and my husband. They all died that day. The tsunami was 10 years ago, but I feel like it just happened. I keep remembering, even though I know my life should go on. The city of Banda Aceh lost around a quarter of its 300,000 people. The main hospital for Aceh, located there, lost 40% of its medical staff. Many patients were killed too. The tsunami occurred while the hospital was treating victims from the earthquake. 2 islands off the northwestern coast of Aceh broke into 4, and in the process lost 7,000 of its 11,000 people. The island of Malenge was completely swept clean of people. After the disaster, none of the 500 people that lived there were left. The only large animals were dogs feeding on the corpses. Aceh province as a whole lost about 5% of its population of 4 million people. Almost all the deaths were along the coast. A few people living inland were killed by the earthquake. In some towns and neighborhoods in Aceh, the death rate reached 90%. The village of Lampuk had 6,500 residents before the disaster and only 700 afterwards. Kalang had 7,300 people before the tsunami and 750 afterwards. There, the only building left standing was a large white mosque. There wasn't even much debris. Everything was swept away. Further south in Pangah, not a single house was left standing, and around 800 of the 1,100 people that lived there were killed. If you're seeing a pattern with the mosques, it may be that those are the best-built structures in these mostly poor communities. Throughout Banda Aceh, bodies were strewn in the streets, rotting in the tropical sun and producing a horrible stench. Many were dumped in mass graves, sometimes 60 at a time, with bulldozers, without a ceremony or funeral rites. This added insult to the injury of the disaster to the largely devout Acehese, who were distressed to see their relatives denied a proper Muslim burial. At first, many bodies were left unburied because local people wanted them to have a proper Muslim burial. They were then buried en masse after a Muslim cleric in Jakarta issued a fatwa declaring in a time of crisis it was okay to bury people without proper rites. 35 minutes after the shaking from the earthquake stopped, the tsunami waves reached the Indian islands of Nicobar and Andaman to the north of Sumatra. The earthquake was so powerful it shifted some of the Nicobar Islands 100 feet to the southwest. The tsunami ripped apart homes, tore up jetties, toppled coconut trees, and smashed fishing boats. In some places there was so much damage just figuring out how to dispose of the debris was a major problem. Many aftershocks occurred in the area, which set off worries about more tsunamis. As many as 1,900 people were confirmed dead, and another 5,537 were missing on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Several entire communities were washed away. Almost 300,000 of 356,000 people living on the islands were affected. More than 40,000 were left homeless and moved into refugee camps. Most of the damage was in the Nicobar chain, which lies closest to the epicenter of the earthquake. Catchall was the worst-hit island. It is barely above sea level and is believed to have been almost completely inundated by water. There, 4,310 of its 5,312 residents were missing. Another 345 were confirmed dead. When Car Nicobar was struck by the tsunami waves, survivors said the waves there were 30 to 50 feet high. Car Nicobar is a flat island. Entire villages and an Indian Air Force base were swept away. An estimated 1,200 were dead or missing. A total of 102 airmen at the base were killed, and the majority were swept out to sea. A distress signal sent from the base alerted government officials on the mainland that a tsunami had hit the islands. Military planes were immediately dispatched to Car Nicobar, but no one stopped to think that the tsunami was heading to the east coast of India. The Catkill Islands were devastated. Some villages were completely submerged and remained that way after the tsunami receded. The West Bay was partly submerged and surrounded by seawater. Many people were trapped there. Those that escaped negotiated some very difficult terrain. Large areas were described as slush. There was no safe drinking water. Survivors lived off bananas and coconuts. The chief of the great Andamanese tribe said that after the earthquake he ordered his people to flee. No one was hurt, he said. The water was rushing up very fast. It seemed to be following us. We stayed in the forest for 5 days. There was some rice. We ate that. Then there was nothing, so we went hungry. Most of the tribesmen lost their homes and everything they owned. All members were airlifted to Port Blair, the biggest city in the island chain, where they could get food, water, and health care. One Andaman man was found alive after 25 days on remote Pilo Panja Island, where everyone else appeared to have died. The backwash of the first large wave of the tsunami pushed him out to sea, but the waves from a second large wave pushed him back on the island. After the water receded, he discovered he was the only person alive. He was injured and managed to survive for 25 days on nothing but coconuts until he was rescued in his underwear, waving a flag made from his clothes. The day after the tsunami, there was another threat, this one of a reptilian nature. Large crocodiles were lurking around broken moats and sunken piers, frightening survivors fleeing the tsunami-hit Indian Ocean island of Hut Bay, wildlife wardens said. The predators left their natural habitat in creeks near the ravaged island and were crowding around damaged jetties, prompting Coast Guard personnel to take action to avoid attacks. These animals were crawling over jetties or thrashing in the waters, making evacuation very dangerous, said Ram Kishan, a forest guard. Some of them were as long as 10 feet or 3.3 meters, added Forest and Wildlife Warden Mohammed Hanafa. Hut Bay is located inland about 4 hours sailing time south of Port Blair. The two were among 15 personnel of India's Department of Environment and Wildlife who fled with their families after towering waves wiped away their homes on Hut Bay, where thousands were stranded without water or food for days. Muhammad Zainuddin, another warden who outraced tidal waves with his family of 4 on a scooter, said despite his training in wildlife handling, he was afraid of the snapping jaws. After all these years in the Andamans, it was the first time I saw so much aggression in the crocs. Perhaps the tsunamis have wiped out marine life, and these creatures are starving, or maybe it is some other instinct, he said. An interesting characteristic of the Boxing Day tsunami was the ripple pattern of the waves. Large masses of land would of course block those waves and protect population centers on the other side of the landmass. Bangladesh is a densely populated, mostly flat nation that is highly prone to flooding. It has half the population of the United States in an area the size of New York State. In 1970, 500,000 people were killed in a vicious cyclone or hurricane, and flooding is a constant problem. But because the waves emanated from the hypocenter in an east-west direction, Bangladesh to the north of Sumatra was hardly affected. In fact, there were only 2 fatalities in Bangladesh. Somalia, on the other hand, on the other side of the Indian Ocean in Africa, 5,500 kilometers or 3,200 miles away, had nearly 300 fatalities. Somalia is due west of Sumatra, and there are no major land masses in between. Also, Somalians would not have felt the earthquake that preceded the tsunami. Singapore, a major population center surrounded by water, and just a 1-hour flight from Aceh Banda, suffered no fatalities. The island of Sumatra blocked the most harmful waves from reaching Singapore. As the saying goes, location, location, location. The southern peninsula of Thailand, however, was not so lucky. The coast of Thailand along the Andaman Sea was directly in the path of the tsunami waves. The first waves hit there 2 hours after the earthquake subsided. Like most of the Indian Ocean nations, Thailand did not have a tsunami warning system in place. Unlike Aceh Banda, southern Thailand was a very popular tourist destination for Westerners. At the time, Aceh Banda was in the middle of a civil insurrection between local separatists and the Indonesian government. That made it difficult for the Western press corps to reach the devastated areas, and even the Indonesian press had its difficulties reporting on the event. In contrast, the first smartphones with built-in video cameras were already out, as well as compact video cameras, and many people vacationing in Thailand had one of these devices. It is no small phenomenon. For the first time, we can see important events play out around the world as they happen on recorded video in the hands of average citizens because they were there at the event and had their camera phones with them. Think of the Arab Spring. That morning in southern Thailand, just as at other beaches close to the epicenter, the tide was sucked out, leaving the coastal areas bare. The first location where the tsunami was noticed was on the Similan Islands, a famous diving site located about 70 kilometers or 40 miles from the resort town of Khao Lak. The sea around these islands, just before the tsunami struck, was reported to have strong currents, and divers underwater felt as though they were being spun around in a washing machine. The death toll among tourists in Thailand would be disproportionately high because they do what third-world villagers would never dream of, except to earn their living. They go into the sea for sport. "We watched the wave coming. It was horrible," said Jason Richards, a British tourist who came to Thailand to dive while on vacation. The suction of the current drew the water right back. People who were snorkeling in 6 feet of water found themselves in the open air or stuck on sharp coral. Then they were swept back into the sea by the wave. It was at least 20 feet high. I don't think it would have been possible to survive if you had been in the sea. There was just tons and tons of water suddenly appearing out of nowhere. On Mai Khao Beach in Phuket City, a 10-year-old British tourist named Tilly Smith had studied tsunamis in geography at school and recognized the warning signs of the receding ocean and frothing bubbles. She and her parents warned others on the beach, which was evacuated safely. John Croston, a biology teacher from Scotland, also recognized the signs at Kamala Bay north of Phuket. He guided a busload of vacationers and locals to safety on higher ground. The withdrawal of water at the beachfront just before the massive first wave hit drew numerous tourists as well as locals. Most had never seen a tsunami. The last one to hit was in 1883 when the Krakatoa volcano erupted. Until the hippies of the 1960s discovered them, Thai islands like Phuket and Koh Lanta were home only to fishermen and subsistence farmers. But over a period of 4 decades, a diverse tourist industry sprung up, servicing everyone from those seeking luxury hotels and yacht marinas to backpackers searching up and down the coast for the next unspoiled inlet. Many were inspired by the Leonardo DiCaprio vehicle The Beach, which was filmed on Koh Phi Phi. As airports were built, the package tourists came in, and destinations such as Khao Lak and Krabi became known throughout the Western world. All of this helps to explain why there were so many tourists on the beaches when the tsunami came. "We were swept inland and got to high ground," said Jason Richards. "People were being plucked up like toy soldiers. I saw a woman carrying her child, and the next time I saw her, her hands were empty. She was shouting, but there was no sound coming out. You couldn't hear her." Dozens of scuba divers went missing. One of the luckier divers, Amy Harding, a 24-year-old instructor, was giving a lesson off Koh Phi Phi, was swept ashore with her group and landed on a hotel roof. Becky Ralph, a 25-year-old art student, was underwater when the tsunami hit. "There seemed to be a shudder and then a giant whoosh," she said. "I was shot out of the water, back in again, and then began to spin. It was like being in a washing machine. I just went round and round in a fast spin, gulping water and fighting to stay alive. I was totally helpless and thought I would drown. After a few seconds I stopped spinning and began to try to swim, but it was impossible. I was just dragged along. The debris of what I think were 2 boats washed over me. 2 people, a man and a woman, swept past. The man was bleeding from his head and his eyes were closed. I tried to reach him, but he disappeared. My air tanks were off and I struggled to reach the surface and to control my breathing. I remember my heart thumping against my suit. Suddenly it all seemed to slow down and I was able to swim to the shore. There was blood coming from one of my ears. I think my diving training and luck were all that saved me." Lak Pong Senthia, age 27 at the time, was a hotel worker at Karen Beach Resort in Phuket. "Many people thought it was a terrorist attack," he said. "Their instinct was to hide, to get behind walls and into basements. It was the worst place to be. The waves were so strong they broke walls, and of course they flooded anything below ground level. One of my colleagues saw tourists being swept back out to sea. He tried to get them onto his boat. They had broken bones. They were screaming for help. One Australian couple were on their honeymoon. I saw them on their balcony at breakfast, and after the waves, the husband was walking around asking if anyone had seen his wife. He didn't know where he was, didn't know his home address. We found his wife, and they were taken to a hospital. It was lucky for them, but others will not be so lucky. The bodies won't be delivered back by the sea for days, perhaps never." Everywhere there was the same absence of warning. Thailand's meteorological department issued an alert concerning possible dangerous currents at 9 a.m. after the first waves had hit. A tsunami warning was posted on a website 3 hours later, but by that time at least 700 people had died in Thailand. Procrastination was fatal. Anyone who went out to explore the fish flopping around on the beach put their life at risk, and most of them probably did not survive. Those who did make it through the tsunami did it because they got on or into a motor vehicle as soon as they spotted the wall of water on the horizon. However, if you waited too long, being on a motorbike or car stuck in traffic would have been the kiss of death. Tourists and hotel staff were fortunate if they headed for the highest levels of the resorts. The more elderly guests often had the most difficult time. Since many of the resorts did not have elevators, they were inclined to stay in rooms on the ground floor where less climbing was needed. But when the waves rolled in, those were the first units to get flooded. As the waters continued to rise, a good number of those elderly guests became trapped and drowned. The locals also encountered problems of their own. The water was deceptive in how fast it moved. Many people didn't realize how far the water would move inland when they saw the first wave push through. And in most cases, the first wave was much milder than the second wave. By the time the second wave came, it was roaring through at 40 miles an hour, picking up rocks, boulders, trees, cars, houses, and really just any objects in its path. In many of the amateur videos, you can see people trying to escape by foot or in their cars and not being able to outrun the oncoming gush of water. Once a person was caught up in the torrent, they would get cut up and pounded by fast-moving debris. If knocked unconscious, a person was as good as dead. Witnesses said that just as many people were killed by the waves pulling back out to sea as they were by the waves pushing into land. Brave people risked their lives to pull victims out of the rushing currents, but the tsunami came so quickly, and without warning, no organized rescue effort could be put together in time. Directly in the path of the tsunami lay the island of Penang, Malaysia's only Chinese-majority state, which attracts holidaymakers because it is more relaxed and cosmopolitan than the rest of the country. Because of its location, Penang Island was the hardest-hit area of Malaysia. Peninsular Malaysia was shielded by the full force of the tsunami due to the protection offered by the island of Sumatra, which lies just off the western coast. By the time the waves reached the hotels and beaches of Batu Ferenghi, Penang's tourist strip, it was nearly 2 hours after the quake, but still no one knew what was to come. Mohammed Wan was swimming near his home on Penang. "I could only watch helplessly while I heard my son screaming for help," said his mother, Rosita. "Then he was under water, and I never saw him again." Although buildings cracked and tottered in the capital of Kuala Lumpur during the earthquake, the nation of Malaysia was fortunate in that the total number of fatalities was limited to approximately 75. That is a figure far lower than that of Thailand, whose southern peninsula area bore more of the brunt of the tsunami. About 1 hour and 45 minutes after the earthquake, the first tsunami wave hit the island of Sri Lanka, a densely populated country just off the southeastern tip of India, with no natural barriers between it and the epicenter of the earthquake, 600 kilometers or 1,000 miles away. The tsunami hit the east coast first at around 8:45 a.m. local time. That's 1 hour behind Aceh Banda. It took another 30 minutes for it to whiplash around the island to the south coast, which was struck around 9:15 a.m. local time. The shock waves from the earthquake were enough to lift the earth 4 inches in Sri Lanka. The waves, traveling at up to 500 miles per hour in deep water, were 180 miles wide. The largest waves were 6 meters or about 20 feet high, meaning even at that long distance the tsunami was still packing a powerful punch. They surged inland up to 1 kilometer. Unlike Thailand, where the waves crashed to shore as towering walls of water, the tsunami in Sri Lanka was more like a surging high tide that wouldn't stop. That is because the waters off Sri Lanka are very deep, while those off Thailand are very shallow. The waves that hit Sri Lanka were widely spaced and kept coming for more than an hour. In some cases they surged far inland, and then withdrew far out to sea, and then surged again. In many ways the most dangerous aspect of these waves was the incoming and outgoing current that swept people away and often far out to sea. The area around Khao Munai on the east coast of Sri Lanka, about 30 miles south of Badi Kolua, was the worst hit area in Sri Lanka. Around 10,000 people were killed along a single 4-mile section of beach, with entire villages disappearing with hardly a trace left behind. One local official said he lost 27 relatives, counted 374 dead around his home, and oversaw the burial of 2,250 people. Most of the victims were ethnic Tamils and Muslims crushed and washed away by a huge wave that sounded like a bomb exploding when it struck. Around 3,000 people were killed at Mali Tevu in northeast Sri Lanka and the fishing villages around it. Entire extended families were wiped out. Residents there were pushed hundreds of meters inland when the waves rolled in, and then pulled out to sea when the waves rolled back. The beach road and many of the houses that were on it vanished. More than 4,000 people died in the southern historical resort town of Gal. Many of them died when water was funneled through a busy bus and train station. In some marshy areas, people literally walked on corpses as a way of escaping the flooding. Not far away, in Hambantota, 4,500 people died, with more than 2,500 bodies being fished from the lagoon near the town. An estimated 1,200 people died that were traveling on the Queen of the Sea coastal train between Colombo and Gal. The train was chugging slowly near the coast, filled with Colombo families out traveling during a local holiday. As they neared Gal, the train was struck by tsunami waves. Many survived the initial wave and clambered out of the railroad cars, only to get swamped and drowned in the next wave. Another 1,000 people died in villages near where the train was knocked over. Even people regarded as champion swimmers in their youth were swept away to their deaths. The train had just stopped in the village of Telwada when it was hammered by the tsunami. The force of the waves tore the wheels off some of the carriages, lifted the train off the tracks, and then lifted the tracks off the ground, scattering the carriages here and there as if they were toys. The tracks were bent and gnarled. The 80-ton engine was twisted like a pretzel. Palm trees were knocked down. Clothing and baggage were strewn all around. Pictures of Engine 59 and the Queen of the Sea were widely shown in the international press and became a symbol of the tsunami disaster in Sri Lanka. A total of 824 bodies were recovered as of February 2005, while many were still missing. Some were passengers on the train. Others were villagers who climbed on the train in an effort to get above the rising water. Many of the victims were Tamils. Several thousand Tamils died in territory controlled by the Tamil Tiger separatist group, as the tsunami came while that nation was entrenched in a bloody civil war. Sri Lanka was also hit in the middle of the tourist season. Hotels were filled with foreigners. Still, foreigners made up only 0.5% of the dead, 160 total, because the worst-hit areas were along the east coast, which does not receive the majority of tourists. Foreigners in Thailand made up a much greater percentage of fatalities than they did in Sri Lanka. Along the beaches, the bodies of many children were found, tangled in wire mesh, used to protect seaside homes from erosion. Corpses were wrapped in sarongs and placed near the side of the roads. In some cases, their burials were carried out with forks and spoons. Most of the victims had been found and buried by mid-January. There were few bodies that were discovered after that. An owner of a guest house in Arugam Bay said he heard screams and commotion, but did not think much of it until my feet got wet. He then ran into the street and was quickly overtaken by the surging water. He was carried away a couple 100 meters, slammed into a wall, and stripped of his clothes before grabbing hold of a coconut palm. His wife and daughter were carried away and deposited in the local library. They managed to escape by slipping out a window before the water reached the ceiling in the building. An 11-year-old girl who was staying at their house was carried away into the sea and never seen again. A government worker, also near Arugam Bay, said he was in his office completing paperwork when the first wave hit. He tried to escape on his motorcycle, but the engine conked out when it was flooded by the rising waters. He managed to save himself by climbing up a palm tree. When the water receded, he returned to his home to find his mother, sister, and grandmother dead and tangled up in debris. He said he had no time to grieve and began organizing people to flee to higher ground before the next series of waves arrived. One woman from the town of Dihawala said, "We were just relaxing here after finishing our morning work. All of a sudden the water from the sea rose close to our houses. Then it went out again. We all stood and watched. The water withdrew almost a kilometer back from the shore. A fisherman from the same village said, "Then all of a sudden, after a few minutes, the water came back again in a huge wall, and we ran, and all of our houses were turned into junk." One survivor said she heard what she thought was an explosion, thinking fighting had erupted between the government and the Tamil Tigers. Her daughter told her, "Water is coming." She then grabbed one daughter and pushed the other out the door and yelled, "Run! Run!" They didn't get far before the water engulfed them. One daughter got caught in some barbed wire. The woman held on and tried to pull her up. She held on until she blacked out. Eventually her husband found her later, vomiting salt water. The 2 girls were found dead, buried under debris. Among the people vacationing in Sri Lanka at the time of the tsunami was former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. He and his entourage were unhurt. They were airlifted from their hotel in a Sri Lankan Air Force helicopter. The Harrow School cricket team survived by climbing on top of a pavilion to avoid the water rushing past them. William Rechtenwald wrote in the Chicago Tribune, "At 9 a.m. I settled for breakfast at the Hotel Club Lanka on the beach at Ahengama. A big wave splashed, and people on the beach jumped back and yelled. In the next minute, 4 or 5 large waves rolled across the manicured lawn and pushed dirty water into the pool. I was on high ground. Then a wave swept in, a large one. I was in water up to my knees. It rushed out, almost pulling me from my perch. I grabbed a concrete pillar. The next wave was up to my neck. I barely could hold on. Then one came over my head, and the force pulled me into the water. I could see cars in the parking lot being tossed like toys. Walls were falling. 6-foot concrete walls crumbled. I was washed back and forth. People on the hotel balcony screamed at me to swim to them, but I could make no headway. As the water receded, I grabbed a piece of netting attached to a concrete pillar and got upright again. In minutes, the water receded the distance of several football fields. The ocean reef was exposed. The hotel was devastated. An English girl, a cute 3-year-old, was missing. The search was on. Hotel staff, a dozen members of her family, searched meticulously, but there was no luck. A guest, an older Sri Lankan who had been dragged from his room by the wave, was found. The staff and guests began CPR, but it was too late. A member of the hotel staff was pulled from the kitchen. He too was dead. There was panic that another wave was coming. Some large waves did sweep onto the grounds of the hotel, but nothing like the first. Louis Cryer was 18 years old and vacationing with his mother and brother at the time. We were staying in an idyllic beach village called Anawatuna in Gal District. It took a matter of seconds for a wall of water about 5 feet in height to start coming in. It was a kind of surge which reached the first floor of our hotel. It flattened walls, trees, and the buildings around us, before rising higher and higher. We tried to get people out. Miraculously, guests who had been in the room underneath us started popping up from the water. One woman was trapped in her locked room because she couldn't find her key. She said the room filled up quickly with water and she took what she thought would be her last breath. Luckily, she found the key and opened the door, which then burst into pieces under the pressure. Buildings were collapsing around us. We tried to pull out, passing people trapped in the currents. When the water finally subsided, we made a run for higher ground and a temple that had become a makeshift safe refuge area. We set up a camp in a hotel up on a hill, and when it was safe to do so, we went back down to salvage anything we could. I remember seeing rooms full of mud and fish. People came up to the temple with dead bodies. We carried one Italian woman with a suspected broken back through the debris to another hotel to get medical help. I met one guy who had been out surfing and was swept a few miles up the coast. He had to walk through all the death and destruction to find his family. Luckily, he found them all. One of the only positives to come out of it was all the humanity of it. It didn't matter about your nationality or religion. Everyone was checking on each other. A few days later, once the road was clear, the High Commission sent coaches to take us back to a refugee center in Colombo. We were fed, watered, offered clothes and flights home, but we chose not to go straight away. We wanted to stay to try and comprehend the reality of what had happened. The main thing we felt was guilt. After seeing the devastation, we were lucky enough to be alive, but many were left with nothing. Once in the UK, I put on an exhibition of photos I'd taken, spoken about it at our school, and raised £3,500 to send back to the village. I gained a newfound respect for the sea. I never realized its power. It hasn't put me off going in the water, but I'm a lot more aware of what it can do. On mainland India, the December 2004 tsunami struck the southeast coast of the state of Tamil Nadu the hardest. The worst hit area was in the district of Nagapattinam, where about 7,100 bodies had been recovered and 1,570 were missing. Most of the dead were women and children. More than 2,500 children went missing. The men, mostly fishermen, were out at sea where it was relatively safe, or were inland working at jobs, or were better able to make a run for it, and better able to survive if swept away. Of the 206 bodies found at one village, 96 were women, 84 were children, and 26 were men. Most of the 200 to 300 missing were children. The territories of Pondicherry and Kerala were extensively damaged, while Andhra Pradesh sustained moderate damage. There were 2 to 5 waves of varying height that coincided with the local high tide in some areas. The waves reached only 5 feet in the areas in the state of Tamil Nadu that was shielded by the island of Sri Lanka, but were anywhere from 13 to 16 feet in coastal districts such as Nagapattinam that were directly across from Sumatra. The duration between the waves also varied from about 15 minutes to about 90 minutes. Based on survivor accounts, the waves in India varied in height from anywhere between 6 and 33 feet, quite a range, and showing again how important location would be. The suddenness of the tsunami became a dominant theme. 20 boys playing a game of pickup field hockey on Marina Beach in Madras were all swept away. The first indications for some that the tsunami was coming was a quiet rising of the sea that began swallowing homes and carrying people away. However, in Madras, observers reported knowing about the tsunami in advance. A wall of water appeared in the sea that stretched across the horizon. A harbor pilot in Madras said, "It looked as if the whole ocean was boiling over. The water was just rising up, spilling over the breakwater and covering the entire jetty. Then, just as quickly as it came in, the sea began retreating, taking people in boats, including a 12,000-ton container ship with it." A 43-year-old fisherman who was mending nets under a tree in Nagapattinam said, "There was a roar, and before I could get up and run, a wall of water about 30 feet high devoured me. I held my breath to keep the salt water from entering my mouth. I knew I was dying. I started looking around for my family, but could only see bodies, mostly women and children, lying all around, still and contorted. I saw dazed men and shrieking women trying to walk away from the sea. We all have seen rough seas, cyclones, and high tides, but nobody ever saw or heard of such a thing coming from our sea." Some of the dead were cremated. Others were quickly buried in mass graves, in part to curb the spread of disease. Many survivors felt guilty because they had survived and loved ones had not. One woman said, "I killed the children. I forced them to come to my house." She had earlier encouraged her daughter and grandchildren to come live with her. She had grabbed the children in the tsunami but lost her grip. Afterwards, she refused to eat. A girl who survived with her siblings but lost her mother said, "Our mother could not run fast. We are young. We ran away faster." One 7-year-old Indian boy allegedly survived after his dog nipped and nudged him up a hill to safety. At a dawn mass the day after Christmas, Father Maria Devanesan, a priest in the South Indian St. Thomas Cathedral, felt the first tremble just as he was giving communion. It was 6:30 local time, and a tremor that had traveled more than 1,000 miles from Sumatra had just arrived in India. Father Maria could see the pews in the old cathedral rattling. The members of the 500-strong congregation, many of them poor Tamil fishermen, and their families who live in shanties at the nearby beach, rose from their knees in fear and ran from the church. Father Maria hurried down the stone steps from the altar, following his congregation. Outside they ran into a mass of people, rousted from sleep, who were running from their homes in panic. When the shaking subsided, Father Maria was able to persuade a small group to follow him back into the cathedral to pray at the statue of Our Lady of Mylapore. The congregants cried and prayed, thankful that there had been no serious damage from the quake, and that this crisis had passed. 2 hours later, Father Maria was back in the cathedral leading Mass when he heard a whisper from the catechist. He went to investigate and found one of the older villagers had just entered the cathedral shaking. "The seawater has reached the steps to the beach, so kindly pray for the people," he said. "And try to finish it fast, Father." Father Maria immediately rushed to the concrete steps behind the compound school campus. The sea had climbed about 15 feet and stopped, just inches before it would have flooded the cathedral grounds. The water was an oily black, but Father Maria pictured images of the Red Sea and Charlton Heston as Moses. "I saw the picture of the 10 Commandments," he said. "That was only cinema. We didn't believe it, but here we saw it. Naturally, it created some shock." Outside the church, umbrella repairman Raju, 45, and his sister Maliga, 37, had been sitting in the sand in front of their shanty on the beach, chatting and watching the fishermen come and go. The surf, only 30 yards away, gave no indication that a giant tsunami wave was racing toward them. As the wave hit the shallower coast, Maliga heard only the idle chatter of her family and friends against the white noise of morning life in the shanties. "We didn't hear anything," said Maliga, who, like many Indian Tamils, uses one name. "It was like a silent wave. Only when Raju and Maliga saw the water suddenly rising did they know something was wrong. At the sound of the first scream from the shoreline, they ran for the steps of the church and watched the sea swallow their one-room home." 9 miles away from the control tower on one of the piers at the harbor of Madras, signal boatswain Guruswamy Napoleon had a 270-degree view of one of India's busiest ports. At 9:05 a.m., just before the haunted villager warned Father Maria, Napoleon noticed a swirling eddy of white foam, like water being pulled down a large drain. He wondered aloud whether it was a big fish. The rest of the crew laughed at him. Less than 5 minutes later, a wall of water stretched across the horizon. The rush of water into Madras knocked out the control tower's power. Then, just when Napoleon thought the worst was over, the water level in the harbor suddenly dropped, and the current started to suck the ships out to sea. The first to go was a container ship, about 650 feet long and weighing around 12,000 tons, snapped free of its bonds. The order went out over the radio for all ships to drop anchor. The tsunami waves came to the island chain of the Maldives around 9:30 a.m. local time, or about 3 hours after the quake. Residents had felt the earthquake but thought little of it. The islands of the Maldives are so low that the tsunami water swept over nearly every inch of the entire nation. There was no high ground, or even dry ground to run to. The Maldives were not hit by destructive waves like the one that struck Indonesia and Thailand. Rather, the tsunami waves were like rising surges of water that swamped the islands, much like Sri Lanka. Islanders reported that they didn't even see the waves. Rather, it felt like the islands were sinking. It took about 5 minutes for the water to surge and retreat. The government said the entire population was affected and development was set back about 2 decades. While there was not the huge loss of life like that experienced in other areas, buildings and infrastructure were badly damaged. 1 in 3 people and half the homes were affected. Buildings in some places were completely destroyed. 10% of the islands were made uninhabitable. 13 of the Maldives Islands were completely evacuated after the tsunami, and 70 others experienced disruptions of water supplies and electricity. 79 islands lacked safe drinking water, 26 had no electricity, 24 had no telephones, and 4 islands lost all communications. The infrastructure on 20 of the islands was completely destroyed. Harbors, jetties, and sewage systems were obliterated. More than 12,000 people were left homeless. The southern and central atolls suffered the worst damage. Almost all of Hura, an island located north of the main island of Mayo, was submerged. Beaches, palm trees, houses and boats, and thousands of tons of sand were all swept away. The international airport was made unusable. 2/3 of Mayo was flooded. A government spokesman told Reuters, "The damage is considerable. The island is only about 3 feet above sea level, and a wave of water 4 feet high swept over us." The government declared a national disaster. Damage could have been much worse were it not for reefs protecting the islands. The Maldives were further from the earthquake than Indonesia or Thailand, but not that much further than Sri Lanka. The reefs were credited with absorbing much of the shock of the waves. The government was given credit for making such a strong effort to protect its coral reefs. The reefs themselves emerged from the disaster largely unscathed. On the small island of Kolyufushi, just 1 mile long and 500 feet wide, water surged over the eastern side of the island, crashing through banana and mangrove trees, destroying homes and a 100-year-old mosque. One resident said, "I thought the whole island was going to go. If it had lasted any longer, everything would have been swept away. Everyone would have perished." The resident said he watched people get swept out to sea as the water retreated, and saw some pulled back to land as the waves returned. He clung to a coconut tree in water that reached his chin. 16 of the island's 1,230 residents died or went missing. Most were under 11 or over 60. All but 5 of the island's 174 houses were made uninhabitable. The banana and mango groves were badly damaged by saltwater poisoning. Kanholdhihu was turned into a ghost island. It was completely deserted. Homes were wrecked, communications were cut off, and wells were contaminated with seawater. A U.S. Marine that was part of the relief team that visited the island told the Associated Press, "I was in Fallujah last summer and saw the devastation and damage there, but it was surgical and aimed at specific targets. Here it's total. Everything is gone." Kanholdhihu is less than a kilometer square. Some said that the surge of water was 10 feet high. 3 people were killed and 50 were injured. The entire population of 3,500 was evacuated. A week after the tsunami, debris from ruined houses, pieces of televisions and toys, and rotting fish stranded by the retreating water covered the streets. 21 of the 87 resorts on the Maldives were forced to close. The White Sands Resort and Spa was one of the worst-hit islands. A 6-foot-high tsunami wave appeared suddenly and was strong enough to send a surge of water through the resort and push guests against the walls of their rooms. 6 people were injured, but no one was killed. All the furniture and appliances were washed away. Guests had to sleep on the beach until they were airlifted out. Over 17,000 foreign tourists were in the Maldives when the tsunami struck. It was the height of the Christmas-New Year season. Beachfront bungalows were flooded. Their windows and balconies were shattered. Power and communications was knocked out. Thousands were evacuated by hastily arranged charter flights. The worst-hit resorts were those on the eastern side of the Maldives, the side facing the tsunami. Several Italian soccer players, including AC Milan striker Filippo Inzaghi, Milan captain Paolo Maldini, and Juventus defender Gianluca Zambrotta, were in the Maldives when the tsunami struck. They were unhurt. The first tsunami waves to hit Somalia in Africa happened more than 7 hours after the earthquake. And even at that great distance, on a completely different continent, the damage to property and human life was significant. Coastal and rural communities in Somalia, as far as 4,500 kilometers or 2,800 miles from the epicenter of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, were swept away or destroyed by the tsunami. As of January 5, 2005, the confirmed death toll stood at 298. According to presidential spokesperson Yusuf Mohammed Ismail of the Transitional Federal Government, more than 50,000 people were also displaced. The tsunami was detected in southern parts of East Africa, where rough seas were reported, specifically on the eastern and southern coasts that face the Indian Ocean. Countries apart from Somalia that recorded fatalities included Kenya, the Seychelles, Tanzania, and even South Africa, the furthest country to report deaths related to the tsunami, which had 2 fatalities. Tidal surges also occurred along the western Australian coast that lasted for several hours, resulting in boats losing their moorings and 2 people needing to be rescued. Australia had a half-meter wave, or about a 1.5-foot wave at Cocos Island, with few other reports of tsunami waves. Most of the damage in Africa was centered in the coastal parts of the autonomous Puntland state in northeastern Somalia, particularly the area between Hafun in the Bari region and Garakad in Muduk. The narrow and low-lying peninsula of Hafun, 1,150 kilometers or 710 miles northeast of Mogadishu, was especially affected. In Puntland, rising waters destroyed properties in Hafun and Kulab, while parts of the towns and hamlets of Banderbala, Il, For, and Bargil were flooded. Other coastal areas, including Lower Juba, were also somewhat affected. The UN reported that the waves destroyed 1,180 homes, smashed 2,400 boats, and rendered freshwater wells and reservoirs unusable. The village of Kulab, near Garakad, was still partially submerged as late as January 6, 2005. At Kalab, Herdahi, and other places, teams from the World Food Program reported that all the boats and other fishing equipment used by the residents to make a livelihood had been lost. In the northeastern Hafun Island, the prospect of spreading diseases was a serious threat to the already weakened survivors, whose possessions were destroyed by the killer waves. Somalia lacks an effective disaster response mechanism, having been ravaged by anarchy since 1991, when dictator Mohammed Siad Barre was toppled, plunging the whole nation into lawlessness. Organized rescue efforts were practically non-existent, and the fragile nature of the government made relief efforts extremely difficult. A World Food Program spokesman said at the time, "They are now without shelter, water, food, and medicine. Cases of diarrhea and other diseases are already being reported. Most of the houses in the town have been destroyed. Personal possessions lay scattered around the town. Boats are beached in the middle of the town. Even money is strewn on the ground." The lack of basic civil administration had compounded the devastation of the disaster in Somalia, even though they were 2,800 miles away and had 7 hours advance notice. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami is the widest-scale disaster with the most fatalities of this century. The event claimed 228,000 lives in 13 countries, from the shores of Indonesia to the coastal communities of Africa, in the space of a few hours. Among them, tens of thousands of children. It displaced 2 million people. The tsunami destroyed towns, villages, and livelihoods. 500,000 houses were damaged or demolished. Fields and wells were poisoned with salt water. It obliterated lives and upset the entire composition of societies. While 9,000 foreign tourists died in seaside resorts around the Indian Ocean, the biggest victims by far were the host communities, in particular in Indonesia's Aceh and northern Sumatra provinces, where 167,000 people died. Another 60,000 people died in Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India, with those 4 countries accounting for 90% of the fatalities. Pledged international aid from all sources for the recovery topped $14 billion by 2008, almost half of it given by private individuals and organizations. In Thailand, few physical reminders of the disaster remain. There are no memorials to be seen. At Khao Lak Beach, for instance, where 3,000 people died, all that is left are the occasional tsunami hazard signs and the color-coded evacuation routes set up in the aftermath of the disaster. Even the Marriott Resort and Spa, where 300 people died, reopened for business in less than 5 years. In Banda Aceh, what little wreckage remains has been turned into a curiosity for sightseers. The 2,600-ton PLTD Apung cargo vessel, which was swept inland in 2004, sat in the middle of a vista of flattened buildings and the tented accommodations of the survivors. These days it is a tourist landmark surrounded by the roofs of rebuilt houses. Can you imagine? A 2,600-ton cargo ship that was lifted 2 miles inland and plopped down in the middle of a busy street. It is still standing in permanent dry dock right where it settled, and visitors can take a walk inside it if they wish. Other things have changed since then. On Boxing Day 2004, as the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and others have conceded, the lack of an effective tsunami warning system contributed to the huge death toll. At the time, there were 6 experimental tsunami buoys in existence. Today, an operating network of 39 exists. Many of the affected areas on the Indian Ocean coast have physically recovered, guided by the motto, "Build Back Better." More problematic are the social, political, and personal consequences of the catastrophe. In villages in Aka, where the tsunami killed a disproportionate number of women, unable to swim, and encumbered by sarongs that made it hard for them to flee, a generation of young men exists who struggle both to find work and women to marry. Beyond the heavy toll on human lives, the Indian Ocean earthquake has caused an enormous environmental impact that will affect the region for many years to come. It has been reported that severe damage has been inflicted on ecosystems such as mangroves, coral reefs, forests, coastal wetlands, vegetation, sand dunes, rock formations, animal and plant biodiversity, and groundwater. In addition, the spread of solid and liquid waste and industrial chemicals, water pollution, and the destruction of sewage collectors and treatment plants threaten the environment even further, in untold ways. The environmental impact is still difficult to assess given the limited resources for such research. There were also some positives that came out of the catastrophe. The tsunami acted as the midwife to a surprising peace settlement in Aka. The tsunami drew international attention to the conflict. Earlier peace efforts had failed, but for a number of reasons, including the tsunami, the inability of either side to militarily win the conflict, and notably a desire by President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono to secure peace in Indonesia, it led to a peace agreement that was reached in 2005 after 29 years of war. Post-Suharto Indonesia and the liberal democratic reform period, as well as changes in the Indonesian military, helped create an environment more favorable to peace talks. The need for massive relief assistance from the international community encouraged both sides to come to terms and allow international teams to enter the province. Another major positive that came out of the tsunami was affected countries now paid more attention to early warning systems. As mentioned earlier, when the Indian Ocean earthquake and resultant tsunami struck in 2004, there was no tsunami warning system in place among any of the Indian Ocean nations. The only warning most people received was the approach of a giant wave on the horizon, and even then it took most observers quite a lot of time before they realized that slow approaching wall of water was a mortal threat to their lives. It wasn't a matter of the needed technology not being available, as was the case when the Mount Pelee volcano erupted. The technology was available. It was in place and operating in the Eastern Pacific. The United States had put it there. The problem was the cost. The nations that were most affected by the tsunami were the mostly poor ones. Nearly 300,000 people died from the tsunami because those nations could not afford a tsunami warning system. In the aftermath of the disaster, scientists and governments, under the auspices of the UN, began working on an early warning system for the region. This system would mirror what the U.S. has set up in the Pacific. It would start with seismic gauges that would detect earthquakes, volcanoes, or other seismic events such as landslides that can trigger tsunamis. But as only a small portion of strong earthquakes produce a tsunami, a warning system based solely on seismic data is prone to producing false alarms. That means the next step is the establishment of sea-based measuring equipment that can detect the formation of tsunami waves before they get to the coastlines. These fall into two main types: pressure recorders in the deep ocean and tide gauges monitoring sea level at the coast. The Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis, or DART system, uses buoys and sensors stationed far out to sea. A pressure recorder on the seabed measures the weight of the water above it, which varies according to wave height, and sends its findings to a buoy on the surface. The buoy monitors the surface conditions and sends this, plus the data from the seabed, to a satellite which relays it back to a receiving station. Germany is working on a joint project with Indonesia to put in place 10 of these buoys, the first 2 of which were installed in November 2005. India, Thailand, and Australia are also planning to install DART buoys along the Sunda Trench, the site of the earthquake that triggered the tsunami. The advantage of the DART system is that it can detect tsunamis far out to sea and allow enough time to warn countries in the region. However, the buoys are expensive to install and maintain. The other option is the GLOS, or Global Sea Level Observing System, which operates entirely at the surface of the sea as well as on land. This system was already in place in 2004 in the Indian Ocean to measure the effects of global warming. At minimal cost, there are plans to upgrade it so that it could be used as an early warning tsunami system, although it would not be as accurate as DART. Perhaps the most important part of the tsunami early warning system is how to get the information to people who are in immediate danger. Primary responsibility for that rests with the governments of the 27 nations bordering the Indian Ocean. They have been setting up individual programs for issuing tsunami alerts to their own people. However, they have been so far unable to agree which country or countries will host the regional alert centers to process international technical data and issue warnings across the area. Thailand, India, Indonesia are forging ahead with their own systems, and Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore are planning to develop warning capacities. Thailand has opened a disaster warning center, which currently receives data from Hawaii and Japan. Alerts can be sent in minutes to national and local governments and the media. Thailand is also installing a network of 76 siren towers along part of its coastline and recently staged a tsunami simulation exercise for emergency services. India also set up an alert center which is monitoring data from seismographs and 11 tide gauges. Indian officials say a full system for the country should be in operation within 2 years. Indonesia plans to spend $125 million on setting up its own tsunami detection system. The UN is helping countries with other long-term measures, including teaching tsunami awareness in schools, training decision-makers and broadcasters, and making sure information is available in all local languages, and staging practice drills. The most recent meeting of the UN's Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System Group also recommended mapping coastal zones to work out which locations are most at risk of flooding and to which areas it would be safe to evacuate people in the event of an emergency. We do have one story of a perfectly functioning tsunami warning system that was already in place at the time as it had been for generations, that had no operating costs and was at near ground zero proximity to the quake epicenter. Saimulyu Island, off Aka's west coast, offers lessons on surviving a near-source tsunami without technological warnings. Saimulyu was just 30 miles away from the center of the Sumatra earthquake. Waves several meters high reached most of the island shores just minutes after the shaking began. The islanders received no advance notice from radios, sirens, cell phones, or tsunami warning centers. Yet just 7 people died. What saved thousands of lives was a combination of natural and traditional defenses, the island's coastal hills and the islanders' knowledge of when to run to them. Islanders had passed along this knowledge, most commonly from grandparent to grandchild, by telling of smong, a local term that covers this 3-part sequence: earthquake shaking, withdrawal of the sea beyond the usual low tide, and rising water that runs inland. Smong stories filled free time, taught good behavior, or provided perspective on a fire or earthquake. The teller often concluded with this kind of lesson: if a strong tremor occurs, and if the sea withdraws soon after, run to the hills, for the sea will soon rush ashore. Smong can be traced to a tsunami in 1907 that may have taken thousands of Saimulyu lives. Interviews in 2006 showed islanders familiar with tangible evidence of the 1907 tsunami: victims' graves, a religious leader's earlier grave that the 1907 tsunami had left unharmed, stones transported from the foundation of a historical mosque, and coral boulders in rice paddies. Lang-E, barely 30 miles from the epicentral area where the tsunami began, evacuated in 2004 with astonishing speed and success. The tsunami is said to have started coming ashore there 8 minutes after the earthquake, the waves reaching heights of 10 to 15 meters or 35 to 50 feet, and swept houses off their concrete foundations. Yet none of the village's 800 residents died. So maybe there is a connection between the folk tale of Yuki and the success of Smong on Saimulyu. Thank you for joining me for the podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. Remember, you are the kitten, innocent and unprotected in your nature, but armed with knowledge and proper preparation, you can survive any onslaught. I will be taking a short break and then returning with an announcement about future episodes. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.